Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host Bob Schleihuber. Let's do the news. We have another loaded show for you today. We'll start with a discussion on events on the ground in Atlanta in the wake of the Rayshard Brooks killing by a police officer after an encounter in Wendy's parking lot provoked by Brooks falling asleep in the drive-thru. An encounter that started off tame, took a bad turn, and Atlanta is basically reeling in the consequences for it. We'll have a discussion with a person who was on the ground to get her perspective of events, not to mention what has been taking place there since. A little later, we'll discuss the strange case of PG&E pleading to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter. Corporations are people too, my friend, and yet, when they're responsible for burning innocent people alive, no one goes to jail, and they continue with the same endeavor that caused the needless deaths of so many. Screw you, Mitt Romney. I wish I could use more emphatic terms, but I'm on a radio show, so I'll keep it PG. You extinguish, meaning the company, 84 lives, 84 innocent people. What would happen to a person if they burned 84 people alive? Do tell me. And let's say it was 20 people. Let's say it was 3. Corporations are people too, whatever. Later in the hour, we'll get into an update on the story we mentioned yesterday on a border conflict between India and China, resulting in the deaths of at least 20 Indian soldiers. India has a right-wing government, so the question becomes, what happens next? In the second hour, we're discussing the irony of NASCAR driver creating a thin blue line representation on his car as retaliation for disallowing the Confederate flag at NASCAR events. Also, I noted several weeks ago that driving the car into protesters was going to be a trend, and here we are with another one in Portland, Oregon. We're also going to get into the Trump Rose Garden speech preceding the signing of the executive order on policing. Last but not least, it is Wednesday. That means it's revelations, the strange, the odd, the spooky, the profound. We have a great one for you today that's going to make me look like a younger man. You can't see it on radio, you're just going to have to take my word for it. But a scientific estimate on the number of alien civilizations in our galactic backyard that we just don't have the technological capability or sophistication to hear the communications. Yes! Love it! But let's start here with something I don't particularly love. Of all the arguments you've heard me make on this show, I think the one that's most disturbing to me is how our government is unmoored from the body politic. This is true on taxes, healthcare, education, trade deals, foreign policy, and policing. Yes, you can choose Pepsi and Coke, but on the choices that substantively affect your life, what the public wants is nearly irrelevant. You have a Frankenstein government. That should bother you. When Obama is telling the American public that he's not having troops on the ground while spending billions of dollars to try to take down the government, killing 500,000 people, those were real people. That should bother you. Black Lives Matter has received the limelight in light of the mass protests, here and for that matter, abroad. One key demand: defund the cops. Now, Joe Biden hears the call. He is, after all, king of blacks, and he runs to the first black church he can find, lies about his work in the civil rights movement, advises cops to shoot people in the leg instead of the chest, and calls $300 million more to the police budget. Now, understand how ridiculous this is. New York, in and of itself, one state, has a budget of $600 billion. But yeah, Joe Biden, keep going with the performative dancing. What about Trump? Trump is president, after all. Joe Biden is just a man in his basement right now. What about Trump? Trump has been under all sorts of pressure, and he is severely at risk of losing the next presidency. Biden, like I said, has been in his basement, but he has still managed to develop and maintain a lead in nearly every national poll and swing states. The public blames Trump for the nearly 120,000 people dead and over 2 million people infected with COVID-19 due entirely to incompetence in preparing for the pandemic and handling its spread. He's also trying to mitigate a sharp attitude shift in regards to the public regarding Black Lives Matter, police brutality, structural racial balance in the criminal justice system against minorities, racial bias in the criminal justice system against minorities, and more importantly, the public is firmly behind the protesters. Those millions of people in the street gets like 80% support from the public. This includes, by definition, some Republicans. 40 million people are out of a job. That number is astonishing to me. With a housing apocalypse that's coming as soon as next month, the government chose to prioritize the owner class over workers and the public, allowing deep and severe economic trauma for people that were already hurting and already had nothing. Trump's presidency is at stake. He has to say something, whether he cares or not. Trump teased an executive order last week and started his press conference on the signing of that order while we were still on air, so we didn't get the opportunity to go about it in depth. I did have the opportunity to listen to the video last night and did a speech on the show very late last night. But the details are basically incentivize PD agencies, police department agencies to adopt best practices in use of force, and share officer misconduct, and co-responder program for nonviolent calls, and ban chokeholds unless the officer's life at risk. You're going to have a lot of officers whose life at risk who ends up choking a lot of people out. That said, there's a part of the speech that warrants special attention due to the severe misunderstanding of what people want and why this performative fart in a jar posing as an executive order on policing amounts to basically nothing. It's here to give the right-wingers a transcendently shallow talking point and to assuage some on the right that may trend towards this notion of policing, but definitely feel like something needs to be done. It's a performative gesture. Let's hear the quote, or let's hear the comment that I'm referring to, though. Let's play the clip.
The hurting families, I want you to know that all Americans mourn by your side. Your loved ones will not have died in vain.
But the president quickly turned to tough talk about law and order.
Americans want law and order. They demand law and order. Some of them don't even know that's what they want, but that's what they want.
You know, the very presence of a cop insinuates crime and concerns around the issues of safety. Otherwise, why have such a device? It's true that people would like to have their crimes prosecuted, white collar and otherwise. Basically, people want a fair and equitable society. And insofar as society is not fair and equitable, there will be proportional chaos. That applies to economic, social, and political equality. There is nothing in the want for justice and equality that presupposes or necessitates the need for cops. Cops are only necessary in the absence of those things, which gets to my point. People don't want law and order, but they are willing to settle for law and order if they're presented with crime and challenges to their safety due to a degrading, falling apart society. One, where the governmental device doesn't prioritizes those people as being necessary or important. And so it lets those particular communities fall into disrepute. Not to mention there's some in our society that have a legacy going all the way back for 400 years, leading all the way up into the 80s and 90s, that have been somewhat abandoned. I'm making the point that basically cops are necessary because of crime. And the whole point of law and order is necessary because of issues of crime. They're not primary, is kind of my point. People are willing to settle, but it's not necessarily what they want. Law is not real. It's an artifact of having power to force and compel behavior. It also must be understood that order doesn't require justice. It only the absence of chaos. Trump could have given this speech at the height of Jim Crow, a law to hold human beings as property, with a government angry that people are aggrieved by the protesting. The key point here is, as I said, people don't necessarily want law and order, but they'll settle for it if it's presented with challenges to their safety. What they do want is peace and security. Those are different things. Issues of safety and security is drastically different than issues of law and order. And Trump's speech here fundamentally misses that point. Bob, I think that oftentimes we are so wrapped up in our capitalistic system that Trump gives a speech. Many times I hear the speech, and the speech is given with a presumption that there will be inequality because we're going to keep the money at the top. And so law and order is just part and parcel to that system, which in that case I somewhat agree with. But if the larger society is really looking at this and they're saying, we really do want peace and security, then you can't get that with law and order. That's something different. Law and order, you don't even have that device there if you had peace and security.
Yeah, I think I hear what you're saying, and maybe I can work through some of my thoughts of what I'm not hearing. I think I agree with you on the underlying value that humans want peace and security. I mean, the vast majority of interactions between all humans on this planet, which is incredible, are peaceful. Think about how many people you walk by when you go to the train or you go on your bike or at the grocery store. It's not like each and every one of those people you're fighting. You don't need a security guard to say like, hey, people, stay separate.
Yeah, you're not watching
I do agree with you. The majority of like human interaction overwhelmingly is peaceful. And I think we often overlook that because we do the news and it's all focused on death, destruction, and conflict, right? It's always focusing on the wars as opposed to like stable pieces or sustainability. I think for me, the law and order conversation really comes down around individualism in the United States and then the ownership of both land as well as property. And we have to remember that we live in a country that 60% of it is owned by corporations or private individuals, and there's a 65% ownership rate amongst homes. And when we've been so ingrained to think that you must protect what is yours and what you own, what is your home, what is your land, then you do need that law and order because you need to make sure no bad guy comes and takes that from you or somebody cheats you or somebody steals it from you. And that, I think, is kind of the concern. And that's what Republicans are focused on, is property and who has the right to make the decision on that space. I think for you on the other end of things, and maybe this is where you can kind of correct me, is that peace and security comes from a whole different thinking of how we orient ourselves in our societies. Yes. That if it's not about ownership, but it's about cooperation, and sharing and making sure that everyone has what they need to survive, then you're not all of a sudden having to fight over different things that are materially made to have some worth to it.
Exactly.
And I think that's a fundamental divide. And I don't think Joe Biden and the Democrats don't have that language. I don't think the Republican Party does either.
Neither does. But that's exactly right. That's why I made the argument that equitable, be it political, economic, or I think it was the third one in there. But because you need those things. If you don't have an economic system where people have the things that they need, you're going to have chaos. I mean, how could you not have chaos? People get it on somewhat of a gut level. Like, for example, outcomes. You have tragic outcomes. Either children's brain matter is less when they're in poverty. And by the way, even outcomes when the people are thrown out of their homes. Those people, and they have kids, those kids have a much harder time. Like, we have tragic outcomes that we accept in our society. I'm saying it is impossible to have a peaceful society when you have an underclass, like 40%, nearly half of your population is an underclass. It's almost manic or amazing that the public would even think of having a peaceful society in that situation. Hence, law and order.
That's the thing, though. We're not oriented around achieving that goal. It's all about de-escalating. It's all about like how can we have less murders as opposed to like build peace amongst people, or how can we better treat people if they get sick and unhealthy as opposed to saying how can we prevent getting healthy. I mean, half of the problems that we have in our society, and this goes to the defunding the police conversation, if we had more social workers, mental health clinic. I mean, the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton's administration, setting caps on Social Security and putting age limits on being able to basically get into the safety net here in this country is done irreparable damage over the last 40 years. Like what neoliberals have done to the state of health in this country and the levels of violence that we're seeing right here show they didn't care about peace either. And so until we actually reorient our society to have those conversations, to talk about how to prevent and keep people healthy, Jamal, I think we're stuck in this false choice. And that's where I think a lot of people go to, like myself, when we say lesser two evils. It's the same evil between Democrats and Republicans and the two established parties. These parties are not parties of peace. They're parties of conflict and law and order. And that's what we heard from Donald Trump yesterday. And for me, Jamal, I guess I push back only on the sense that I think the speech was incredibly, it was a successful speech for Donald Trump. He said what he had to. Yeah. He gave enough to people that were starting to ask a little too many questions because he just said he was going to do anything. Because he just said, please reform. People, oh, yeah, thank you. And that's enough for people. I appreciate, Jamal, the anger and the heat you come in with today to demand more, because oftentimes people stop there and they say, all right, well, he did something. But right now, I think we're seeing this growing call to demand more. Jamal, let's turn to our first break of the hour here. In our first hour, we'll be talking about the latest from Atlanta, following more information on the police officer who killed Rashard Brooks. We'll also look at the U.S.'s fallout flat-out refusal to hold corporations accountable for deaths. And later in the hour, we look at the first military conflict between India and China in 45 years. And if that's not enough, don't you worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in D.C. We're back after this.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas, continuing to bring you live programming daily from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on 105.5 FM in the nation's capital. You can also check us out on the Progressive Soapbox YouTube channel. You can see Jamarl's beautiful face, and hopefully, Jamarl, you better be putting those photos up of me. My mom watches every once in a while and wants to make sure I'm doing all right. If you're not able to check us out live on either of those platforms, you always can check us out on any podcast platform, iTunes, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, or you can always head over to Sputnik News and catch our great shows as well as all of our great writing and reporting from our staff. We turn our attention now at 12:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in Atlanta, where more information has now been released on the police officer who shot Rayshard Brooks in the back on Friday, June 12th. Police records show that the Atlanta police officer Garrett Wolf had citizen complaints against him dating back to 2015. All of those incidents were accompanied by notes that said no action was taken against him. The only time he faced any punishment of any kind for the infractions was when a 2016 use of force complaint resulted, hold on, in a written reprimand the following year, really holding the cops accountable out there. To talk about this and much more is Robert Johnson, a queer Black woman and a student at Georgia Tech University. Robert, thank you for joining us.
Hey, I just wanted to clarify, I'm a non-binary white student at Georgia Tech, but I'm joined by one of my friends who's a queer Black woman at Georgia Tech.
There we go.
And I just
yes, thank you.
want to make sure that's clear. I just want to say I'm coming to you from Atlanta. I'm on currently stolen lands that was stolen from the Creek Indians or Native Americans by James Oglethorpe. And I'm living on stolen land built by stolen people, and we should really give it back to the people.
Well, thank you for being with us, Robert Johnson. To tell us who your friend is, and I'll start there with your friend, ask to introduce themselves. And as I opened there in the leadoff, an officer once again had past performance issues leading to the death. We saw the same thing in Derek Chauvin, the officer there in Minneapolis who killed George Floyd, was the subject of 18 prior complaints against him with the Minneapolis Police Department's internal affairs. What's the energy been like there in Atlanta, and have the protests sustained themselves since Friday?
Hey, I'm Robbie's friend. My name is Jody Bartolo. I'll let Robbie speak more on the protest.
Yeah, so since 2 weeks ago on Friday was the first protest outside of the CNN Center. That was the protest that I was arrested at. And it's been incredibly encouraging to see the growth in the protests since then. There have been protests like all up Marietta, down to the south side, out to Decatur, all over the city. People are showing up daily, supporting their community, that's speaking out against these injustices. Most importantly, they're wearing their masks and taking care of each other and taking the precautions necessary to keep people safe. And the last part is only become more organized and more detailed in their demands, and I think that's really added to the momentum of the move.
Yeah, it's quite incredible to see Jamarl. I mean, basically, 19 days into the movement, and it's still growing. I'll ask you then, Jody, what has it been like from your perspective? Tell us a little bit more about the activism and the organizing taking place.
I mean, it's been great to see the community come out there night after night, day after day. People don't realize that people are getting out there at 9 a.m. in the morning, till 2 o'clock in the morning the next day around Metro Atlanta and then the surrounding communities. And obviously, Black people are out there risking their lives every day. And then we have many allies out there as well. So just seeing people come together and seeing over the weeks, people really understand the true reason you're out there, and a lot of the demands really becoming more secure and honed in on. That's been really good to see.
And I just want to add on that, we've got 24-hour jail support set up with the amazing Atlanta Jail Vigil team. So they're outside of Atlanta City Detention Center and Rice Street every night, rain, snow, sunshine, whatever you may have, giving people rides, giving people foods, and just offering up support for the protesters and demonstrators who are getting locked up.
I did want to ask a little bit here about, we had talked briefly about the intergenerational struggle that is taking place both in the streets and the protests, but also the intergenerational class struggle between those who do have and don't have. What I've been really impressed by, and I was excited to talk to you, Robert. I can't speak to Jody, how old you are, but it was the fact that you are a Georgia Tech student. I believe both of you may be affiliated with Georgia Tech, is that we have a younger movement of young protesters within the Black Lives Matter coming out since the formulation of it, starting in 2012 and then in earnest really growing since the Ferguson uprisings in 2014. You both were in your mid-teens, I believe, when these events took place at first. I'm curious how younger activists and organizers are entering into the space and what tools and knowledge they're bringing to the movement.
So one thing that I mentioned to you yesterday when we chatted briefly is that this isn't a fully fleshed out idea by any means. It's just something I've observed and am curious to learn more about. But really viewing generations as a capitalist tool to distract from intergenerational working class struggle, and thinking about how many divisive rhetorics are used around generations that distract from our shared struggle and our shared liberation one day. But I will say the activist and organizing scene in Atlanta is so incredibly young. There are teenagers out in Cobb County. I went to a rally the other day in Smyrna, organized by Campbell High School alumna, Camille Trotman, and it was amazing. She got in touch with organizers, with county commissioners, with young artists that were selling their art. I was able to buy a really sweet t-shirt and a piece of art for my room. It was just an amazing thing. And these people are out here organizing all of this at young ages. And they're still going to high school. All my friends and I are still taking classes. We're still working. We're still forced to continue grinding in this late capitalist society that we're stuck in. And the youth are really leading that momentum forward. And I will say I got into the Black Lives Matter movement a little bit back in high school. And after the death of Philando Castile, I went to a few protests downtown. And even then, it was young Atlantans that were leading the march and leading the charge.
Jody, I want to ask you a question, and I don't want to distract from the death of Rayshard Brooks, because we do need to hold his name up and be focused and attentive to what his family must be going through right now. But the side conversation that's also taking place around the burning of the Wendy's, the parking lot in which Rayshard Brooks was killed at was at a Wendy's. And for those that don't know the story, basically it's alleged that 2 white women were behind the starting of lighting the fast food restaurant on fire with allegedly fireworks and a blowtorch. Crime Stoppers and the Georgia Arson Board have offered a $20,000 reward if anyone comes forward to identify the suspects. I'm curious the conversation in response to these 2 women allegedly burning the Wendy's. Are they being seen as co-conspirators right now? Do they distract from what Rayshard Brooks wanted? I know for me as a white person, I never go to a Black Lives Matter rally and begin or start any chants. I'm there to follow the guidance of people that I feel have a much greater claim to the space in that moment than myself. And so these 2 white women, did they overreach their bounds, or are they being seen as co-conspirators and part of the movement?
Wait, before you answer that, Bob, you need to go start chants, man. You have your black card. Go for it.
I'm absolutely not. So anyways, I do not feel like that's the best usage of my abilities. But Jody, get in there.
Yeah. Surrounding the Wendy's, and I drove by it for the first time this morning, actually. And the only word I came up with to describe it was powerful, because it's 3/4 of the Wendy's is just rubble, completely burnt to the ground. But then out front, there's like this ray of hope that is balloons and words of kindness and a memorial for Rashard Brooks. And it's really a powerful, powerful scene. I want to start by highlighting how guilty Wendy's is and how much blood they have on their hands, and why I don't believe anyone should mourn the burning of this Wendy's. Their CEO and their C-suite executives are deep in profit off of food deserts, open stores where Black people do not have access to grocery stores. Prison labor, wages, free wages, and the on exploitation. So Wendy's is definitely complicit in this white supremacist racial capitalism that we all experience. And I personally think that the conversation surrounding the white women who allegedly burns down the Wendy's is a huge distraction from the struggle of justice that we need moving forward. Most of the Blacks that I've seen in Atlanta are not necessarily focusing on the demographics of who started the violence. I will say, I fully agree with you, Bob, that my role as a white person is simply to get out there and amplify voices and keep people safe. I'm never going to be the one to throw a water bottle or throw a rock or light something on fire. You better believe if someone else does it, I'll put my body between the police and them.
I have two questions. You said something that I think is immensely interesting, and that I tend to ask, and my wife tends to run away from me when I ask. I think I even asked Bob one time, and he never answered. You made the point that saying no one should feel sorry for the Wendy's, that basically the Wendy's was burnt down, and so this is a company that deals with this kind of exploitation. And look, to some degree it's true, right? That when you go and buy a hamburger, you're buying it from somebody who's basically being paid a horrible wage for a piece of meat that is not necessarily the best. Part of it is green slime or whatever. And you have animals that are basically being abused in that process, which are creating gas or whatever in regards to the atmosphere. Like, it's a horrible process all in total. Would that justify the burning of all fast food joints? Because all fast food joints are basically involved in that process. And on top of that, the political edge. As you guys are engaging in this, I know you said there are a lot of people who are young. Are they thinking in terms of how do they convert that into a political win? Meaning not party stuff, just in the sense of we have a political objective that we want to get accomplished, and how do we go about accomplishing that political objective?
Yeah, I will definitely say that a lot of the political education and the idea of embodying your politics is deeply, deeply missing, specifically from allied communities in the Atlanta organizing scene. Like, I was shocked at the comments, like insensitivity, lack of understanding and nuance of the other white protesters who were arrested with me. Like, it was a really discouraging moment.
What do you mean? You say it was a discouraging, heartbreaking moment. Could you explain?
There were white protesters who had been arrested, and they were trying to hit on Black women who had been arrested, or were talking about how they hope they become famous and they hope CNN covered their arrest and stuff like that. So that was really put into perspective to me that while there are a lot of bodies out there fighting, a lot of bodies out there are missing the politics to turn that into a political revolution.
Yeah, it's powerful, Jamar. I mean, this is what I think we often focus on, the Bernie Sanders voter, like the young, Black, engaged and lefty person, but then there's plenty of like young people in Washington D.C. and across the country. I mean, we're seeing rapid gentrification where you have an influx of wealthier people into these spaces, and we talked about on the show here how Black culture and Blackness is basically sold to white people into these new gentrifying neighborhoods, that it's like cool to be right, and so all of a sudden be like, it's cool to go to protests, right, and like have your photo up on Instagram to send all your friends, like I was there fighting for it. But these people aren't then going back and like engaging in their local neighborhood politics or their city council, or actually educating themselves on history, Jamar. And I think that is this whole other layer to it. Again, we always kind of think of younger generations as being forward-thinking, intellectual thought leaders, but in reality, there's a lot of my generation, a lot of Gen X, and obviously any generation that is always working against the tide of progressivism, if you want to see it like that. But it is a kind of another layer. I hadn't really thought about that, Jamal. You really sparked an interesting thought there, that intersection between commodifying Blackness and then commodifying the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, it is being commodified. Do you remember when they came out with the Kaepernick shoe for Nike?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, that's a business move, right? I mean, it's the commodification of, everything that is Colin Kaepernick all of the realness associated with him taking that particular stance commodified into a shoe. You can feel like Kaepernick wearing the shoe. Like, it's so weird the way that could take place. Have you seen, when you guys are out there protesting and you guys are are you ever worried about that? Like, if it doesn't take a political edge, that it may be co-opted by either a party or something to that effect? I mean, for example, Joe Biden taking the knee in the black church. Like, it's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. He puts out a plan that's irrelevant. But by the same token, the Democratic Party right now is doing everything that they can to try to associate themselves with this movement. Are you concerned with that?
I'm very concerned with that. They're doing everything they can except for what is being asked of them to associate themselves with the movement. And you see it with the kente cloth of the Democratic Congress representatives. Like, just the commodification and the ability of Black culture amidst this movement. And I've seen it time and time again in Atlanta. So many people showing up, taking the Instagram post and leaving 30 minutes later, not reaching out to DAs, not reaching out to survivalist organizations. Like, Atlanta has so many amazing survivalist programs going on right now. Like, it's not everybody's job to be out there protesting on the front lines. Every role looks different in this revolution. There are so many ways for people to plug in beyond, like, digitalized, pencil that is online activism. And my friends and I are constantly asking ourselves the question of, what is your intent when posting online? Are you posting to raise awareness or fundraise? Or are you going to, like, actually continue the conversation, or are you just trying to get out?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one example about co-opting and intergenerational struggles. I mean, I think of Atlanta's famous Andrew Young, the former executive director of Southern Christian Leadership Conference and a close confidant to Martin Luther King Jr., who just 4 years ago called protesters unlovable little brats. And he's here on a private corporate jet, Jamar, by Walmart. I mean, Walmart is co-opting big-time civil rights leaders, and then they're calling these younger protesters who actually aspire to be the Andrew Youngs of the world. I mean, it's a great irony, right? As these civil rights leaders are growing old, selling out, and younger protesters are inspired to take to the streets to fight who they've become based on what they had done in the past. And so we're seeing that struggle. I did just want to ask either Jody, if they're still here with us, or you, Robbie, if you have any thoughts on Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms there of Atlanta reportedly being on the short list to serve as VP for Joe Biden. Bottoms was also featured on CNN along with Muriel Bowser of Washington, D.C. on Sunday, asking questions how to address gun violence and violence within their communities. Any thoughts on Keisha Lance Bottoms you want to share with the world?
Yes, many thoughts on Keisha Lance Bottoms, unfortunately. I just want to start by saying Black women and Black queer folks have warned us about Keisha Lance Bottoms since before she announced her candidacy. One of her first acts was increasing the Atlanta police budget $10 million during coronavirus, while all the budgets across the board, especially education, was slashed. The police received $12 million in extra funding. Just recently, in 6/7, she called for $13 million funding. And when she showed up at the protest, she did not talk to any of the organizers. She did not let them know ahead of time or ask for permission to be there. She marched for 15 minutes and then immediately went back home.
Yes, it made me feel like Pete Buttigieg showing up at that Fight for 15 event where you get the photo and you get the hell out of there. Well, with that, we do have to let you get out of here. Robert Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. Robert, where can people find more of you and your work online?
More of me on my work primarily on Twitter at Sartre was gay, at Sartre, S-A-R-T was gay. I do want to shout out a few fundraisers really quickly. There's one great movement led by formerly incarcerated Black women in Atlanta trying to close the APGC and invest those funds into the Black community. There are other organizations also work and getting organizers out of
Talk.
That is fantastic. We may have lost you there at the end. Make sure to tweet us at Sputnik Misfits and share all of those different great organizations on the ground. Shout out to Robert Johnson and Jody Bartolo for joining us. We turn to a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik live in DC. We're back after this.
is Dominic Carter, a political reporter in New York for Verizon Files TV News.
This is Dr. Bill Honigman of Progressive Democrats of America, PDAmerica.org.
Hey everybody, my name is Tim Black of The Tim Black Show.
This is Tom Luongo of Gold Coast and Guns.
Hello, this is Benny Johnson.
Hi, this is Juanita Broderick, author of You'd Better Put Some Ice on That.
This is Jamal Thomas from the Progressive Soapbox.
Hey, this is Raheem from D.C.
This is Rachel Blevins, a correspondent with RT America, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
When I'm waking up in the morning and I'm looking for what's on the queue for the day, I tune to Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
The wokest radio show for your wokest AM.
These guys are the best in the business and experts when it comes to policy.
They're bringing you the top headlines with an angle that you won't see in the mainstream media.
Fault Lines is the greatest show on the radio. I enjoy immensely talking with Lee and Garland. They always treat me from either side with due respect, and it's a wonderful conversation.
The best morning news show in America. Fault Lines with Nixon and Stranahan.
Lee and Garland speak truth to power from the depths of the swamp itself, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with the bearded brawler, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are digging what we are putting down, give up the like, share the video. Also, if you haven't already, do hit that subscribe button and the notification icon. If you guys want to get involved in the conversation, give us a chat, tweet, or call at 202-521-1320. Corporations are people too, my friend. Yes, I've been thinking about that quote since last night. I haven't necessarily been to bed yet. And I did a video on that, and it plagued me greatly. The thought of someone burning to death bothers me. Why am I quoting this detestable quote? Even the offensive comment from failed presidential candidate and senator from Utah, Mitt Romney. Like I said, it's the first thing that came to mind when the New York Times ran that article on PG&E pleading to 84 counts of involuntary manslaughter for its negligence in starting the worst fire in California's history. In the courtroom on Tuesday, Chief Executive of Pacific Gas and Electric, Bill Johnson, repeated, "Guilty, Your Honor," 84 times, each plea representing an innocent life, many of which burned to death, all for this company's well-demonstrated dogged pursuit for profit at the expense of infrastructure, maintenance, and of course, safety. Guilty, Your Honor. 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 84 times. I am here today to take responsibility for the fire that killed these people. Mr. Johnson, who joined the company last year and will leave at the end of the month. This is the New York Times. I've heard the pain and anguish. No words for me can ever reduce the magnitude of the devastation. That's right. No words can ever reduce the magnitude of the devastation. New York Times is reporting as part of the district attorney PG&E has agreed to pay the maximum penalty, $3.5 million. 84 lives extinguished. Some, many, burning to death. One guy committing suicide. $3.5 million, along with $500,000 to cover the costs of the county's investigation. A state judge has to approve the agreement, but New York Times notes that Wall Street firms have paid larger fines and penalties stemming from the financial crash of 2008. Also, the idea of the reputation being hit so horribly that it destroys the company is not even likely, as PG&E is the state-regulated monopoly and the sole provider of power for most customers. 84 lives. One person committed suicide. Imagine for the moment your grandmother burning to death. These people didn't have to do it. Meaning, this was entirely for the pursuit of cash. I read ferociously through this article for the term jail wasn't present. I read for the term prison. It was only present once, and it was just to say that no one was going to prison. The company is already on probation. The company has a history of negligence causing deaths, explosions, and fires. The fire in this case was started when a live wire broke free from a tower that was a quarter of a century past the point that PG&E itself, by its own standards, consider useful life. Don't tell me that corporations are people too if the corporation can't face the death penalty or be put in prison. This should be under public ownership and control. Vital services should not be held to the whims of the capitalistic intention. All businesses have this highest priority of profit as their stupid human trick to earn money. Why would you want your vital services that millions of people need to live put up in competition against the whims and the greed of a few? Bob, this case bugged me to no end because I started putting myself in the place of, what if that was my mom or grandmother or anybody? Those people were innocent people and no longer here.
Yeah, and the snap of the fingers. There's terrifying and remarkable documentary called Fire in Paradise that looks at the campfire, and it was so many things that led up to that fire that were so remarkable that allowed the fire to basically spread like it did. And when you actually watch the film, no one actually thought a fire was like that possible. It covered so much ground so quickly, Jamal, that they couldn't even evacuate. They weren't even evacuating the areas in which the fire went because they thought there'd be no way it could move as quickly and as fast as it did. And in the video, the documentary, there's just the horrific image of a car burnt out with somebody in their seatbelt still completely skeleton. And it's just etched in my head as well, and it continues to sit there. And it really speaks to what capitalism is allowed to do without repercussions.
Yeah.
And this whole idea that capitalism is somehow the great innovator, the great creator of society. It's what allows us to flourish as humankind when all this devastation, and especially the environment, and none of these corporations are held accountable. Because you can never say, oh, climate change that happens in 15 years from now is accountable to the smokestacks at this corporation right now. We don't allow those lines to be drawn and for people to be sued. And there's a few creative lawsuits out there. The kids' climate lawsuit out on the West Coast in Washington that's actually suing Donald Trump, saying that he's infringing on their life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness because of his environmental policies is really remarkable. But it's a kind of a show lawsuit in many ways, right? Like, we're not actually holding these corporations accountable in any which way. And ultimately, it's not ultimately, but often it's financial. And this company says, oh, we're bankrupt, we don't have any money, sorry, we would pay you if we could. None of these people ever go to jail. And I guess that's always the most frustrating part, is even if there's financial punishments tomorrow, these people have so much hidden away in their mattresses that it really doesn't actually affect any individual at the end of the day.
Yeah, it needs to go deeper than that. I mean, it really does. Corporations are not people too. If I hold the door open for you, I'm not going to charge you a nickel for doing it. The corporation would. And I take issue with this, insult even, on the notion that in any way, a person with all the potentials and capabilities of that person have at their disposal. A person, your society could choose to work cooperatively. A person could give their life in service for a family, for kids, for an ailing grandmother. People have all sorts of things that they choose to dedicate their life to, not the singular pursuit of profit, which is all these companies are. Fictional legal devices that allows them to make profit. It's like, get out of here with the people stuff. Also, to make to your point, Bob, you're dead on. Negative externalities. That basically, you can have these companies that produce massive amounts of carbon stored in the atmosphere with a straight face say, we're not creating pollution. You are. It's just in the atmosphere. It's one of those things that's killing all life on this planet. And yet, it goes on, and there's no consequence for it in the sense of, no, you're destroying life on Earth. It's the same thing with this. It's like, yeah, they could have extended the supplies. They could have made the infrastructure, let's say putting some of the infrastructure underground and ensure that the life, that the uptime is better, and ensuring that these fires and these things wouldn't take place. But that costs cash. And it costs cash. So when you look at it and you have to weigh it like, what are the chances of a fire? Let's run for it. Yeah. Let's go for it.
I mean, it's remarkable. At the end of the day, more people will spend time in jail for burning that Wendy's than people do for killing 84 people and destroying an entire town. That's some perspective. Jamal, we do need to take a quick break before we take a look at the escalation of conflict between India and China and whether or not the two sides will be able to avoid a larger war. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. If you guys are digging what we're putting down, give up the like and the share. Also, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you know when we are on, we're doing our thing. Also, your engagement helps make the show what it is. So if you want to join in on the conversation, give us a chat, tweet, or for that matter, give us a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Enunciate. Let's turn our attention for the moment back to Asia. We briefly reported yesterday that the Chinese and Indian troops clashed at the border at the mountainous regions of Lakota, high in the Himalayas. The fighting led to the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers, including a commanding officer, in the first deadly clash with Chinese troops in 45 years. Think about that. It is now being reported, thankfully, that Beijing and New Delhi have supposedly reached an agreement to lower the tensions along the border. To continue the conversation, we are joined with Dr. Ashan Butt, Associate Professor of the Speeh School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, to talk about what's been happening this week between India and China. Dr. Butt, welcome to the channel.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So the last time we had you on the show, we talked about the internal conflict within India regarding Kashmir and the relations between India and Pakistan. Now, it looks like we're seeing this conflict spill over into China. So now that China is claiming that India is violating the terms governing the line of actual control, tell us more about how the region is actually demarcated and how the sides are either respecting the agreement and whether each side may be looking to take additional territory.
I guess we would start with the extent of the certainty of the border in these regions. These are not clear-cut, very, very well demarcated borders, either the India-China one or the India-Pakistan one, whether we call it the line of actual control or the line of control, respectively. Mainly because of the terrain. These are extremely altitudinous sort of points on the world map. It's in the Himalayas. We're talking 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet above sea level. And so these lines on the map are not drawn very, very concretely. And so that does leave a lot of room for interpretation and, of course, for sort of a quote-unquote mischievous sort of sense of aggrandizing territory. So definitely the way that the borders are drawn or not drawn up there do give both countries an opportunity to sort of forward their claims. Generally speaking, India and China have had a number of border disputes. They have an extremely long border, roughly 3,000 miles. So, and all along that border, whether in India's northeast or in the sort of Kashmir and Ladakh region in its northwest and north, both sides have seen clashes or tensions in the past, and roughly there are about 2 or 3 dozen points on the border which are disputed. The good news is usually these border disputes are dealt with at the diplomatic level rather than through military clashes. So this incident is out of the ordinary in that respect, in that we have seen an escalation to violence. But on average, these disputes are dealt with peacefully.
Looking at this conflict, I think the thing that jumped out to me the most in this, Modi is a right-winger. Typically, right-wingers tend to be more militaristic in regards to and hyper-reactive in responses to things like this. With 20 of his troops killed, looked like the incentive would be for him to escalate, not necessarily to de-escalate. So what does this tell us about what took place from the standpoint of China's side? I mean, China hasn't released their death tolls. And again, part and parcel to not doing that is because you don't necessarily want an incentive or that force, that pressure on you to have to respond to the conflict. Why? What does this say about the relationship between these two and the initial flashpoint, especially from the standpoint of what might have taken place with China, where Modi feels like there's some level of parity where he doesn't necessarily have to respond?
I mean, I guess I'd approach that question in a couple of different ways. The first thing I would say is that, obviously the balance of power, the balance of military power is singularly important in crises like this. And while Modi's government feels quite comfortable pushing Pakistan around, for instance, and you're right to note his nationalism, if we can call it that. Obviously, the balance of power between India and China is very different than the balance of power between India and Pakistan. When it comes to Pakistan, India is a much more powerful state, or at least a reasonable state. When it comes to China, it's weaker. And so the main reason it doesn't want to escalate, the main reason it's been relatively diplomatic in its rhetoric, is precisely because it doesn't want a situation where it's facing a much tougher and a much stronger neighbor in a full-blown conflict. The last time that happened in 1962, India suffered a humiliating defeat. Now, obviously, India's military is not the same as it was in 1962, and it's undergone several military modernization efforts. But guess what? So has the PLA, and the Chinese army is not the same as it was in 1962 either. So India has lots of very basic military strategic reasons to avoid escalation in this conflict. So that's really, I think, the main cause of the relative restraint that we've seen in the rhetoric.
China has been trying to get basically unify many of the countries, the Belt and Road Initiative. Is India part of that? Meaning, are there financial investments in India that may cause, let's say, some level of pause in regards to Modi's response?
To the contrary, India has been quite vociferous against the Belt and Road Initiative, especially the sort of South Asian manifestation of the Belt and Road Initiative, because China and Pakistan are very close allies, and they've agreed. China has built infrastructure in territory which India does not consider China's right to, it does not consider it China's right to build infrastructure there. The China-Pakistan economic corridor, which runs through Pakistani and Chinese territory, but India sort of has issues with that. So India is very much against the Belt and Road Initiative, at least the South Asian portions of it. That said, India and China do have reasonably deep economic ties, billions of dollars of trade. So there are economic incentives to temper conflict for sure. But the Belt and Road Initiative specifically, no.
I'm curious then, kind of going to those interrelations between the kind of larger conflict of the area. We haven't talked much about Pakistan, having you on the show here today. We're listening to Political Misfits live in D.C. You can give us a call, 202-521-1320, talking about the escalation and seemingly de-escalation now here between China and India. Dr. Boyd, can you kind of lay out what it is each of these countries are looking to accomplish? I know we only have 5 minutes left here in our interview, but what do you think is the goal here for India? I mean, it seems like they're drifting so far right socially. China seems pretty focused on the economy, and Pakistan, I don't want to say they're playing catch up in many ways, but it also seems like they're not able to advance their interests as much as these other two countries. Is there kind of a status quo the three countries could find, or are they at odds with their each country's goals?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, the one thing I would say is a lot of times these sort of territorial disputes, they're sort of they're off the radar in many ways. They're relatively small, at least in the India-China case. I mean, I'll leave the Pakistan-India case aside for just now. But the India-China case, these border disputes don't usually escalate to violence. What both sides aim to do is either consolidate or in very minor ways extend their territorial control. That's part of what's been going on the last couple of years. In 2017, India and China faced off in near Bhutan in this place called Doklam, in a similar sort of standoff that we're seeing today. But generally, these things start with, one or both sides trying to encroach upon the other's territory, not in a wholesale manner, but in a piecemeal manner, where you're trying to take maybe 20, 30, 40 square kilometers of territory and sort of establish a new status quo. So that's really the context for these relatively minor disputes. Now, right to note that there are obviously much larger geopolitical currents in South Asia. And you can definitely see sort of India's foreign policy reflect its sort of domestic dispensation much more in the last 3 or 4 years, where the so-called Doval doctrine, where Narendra Modi and his national security team have favored a much more sort of muscular or strident or forward-facing sort of foreign policy, especially with respect to Pakistan foreign security policy. So it is one of those things where, yes, the domestic politics do matter, and the type of leader that you elect will sort of obviously impact the type of foreign policy, security policy you follow. But we have to remember that this type of incident, or at least the precursor to this type of incident, is not new. This has been going on for decades. Now, the escalation may be new, but the core causes are not new. And it is certainly the case that geopolitical currents matter. India and China's relationship really has suffered in the last decade. I would say in the 2000s they certainly weren't allies, but they were reasonably. They adopted a reasonably sort of live and let live type of policy, and sort of concentrated on things like trade and economic exchange. That forward momentum, that trajectory has definitely been sort of cast aside in the last decade or so. India and China have much colder relations, and India and Pakistan are still sort of stuck in their 70-year-old sort of rhetoric and very, very harsh policies towards one another.
Dr. But let me just say, I did want to interrupt you as we just run out of time here, because I did want you just to make a quick comment. Does the U.S., the U.K., or Canada have any interest here in India, in Pakistan, and China amongst them right now, or are each of these Western powers completely distracted at domestic affairs right now?
Issue is a big issue with respect to COVID-19 and the pandemic, and the response to the pandemic in all of those countries. More to the point, I don't think India or China would be especially welcoming of foreign interference in this conflict. They're two big, powerful countries. They have a lot of they take themselves very seriously, and they probably are not looking for third-party mediation in this. They're probably thinking, well, we can handle this on our own.
Well, if there's a hotline to U.S. imperialism, you can try to give them a call and let them know that. But otherwise, I'm sure the U.S. will have plenty of thoughts along the road. That was Dr. Ashan Butt, Associate Professor at the School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University. Dr. Butt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
With that, we turn to our second hour of news, politics, and culture. In the second hour, we will be joined by a pretty bad lefty to talk about white America's social whiplash to the Black Lives Matter movement. In our weekly Revelation segment, we learned that we are not alone. Well, at least maybe we're not alone. Jamar, we'll have to get into it again. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, where we are not afraid to go against the grain, not afraid to do it for 1 hour, Jamarl Thomas, not afraid to do it for 2 hours either. We enter our second hour here of Political Misfits. I'm Bob Schlehuber here with Jamarl Thomas. You're listening to 105.5 FM Sputnik Radio. You could also be checking us out on the Progressive Soapbox, the YouTube channel run by our good friend Jamarl Thomas. Jamarl, how often do you get videos up there? It seems like you're quite proficient at getting new videos out there. What do you shoot for several a day?
When real men can't sleep, real men do the news. So, that could be anytime. At 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. I think this morning I had one at like 3 or 4 in the morning. Something like that. I woke up at like 2 o'clock and was wide awake and just did videos.
Yeah, they're great. I love the short ones, 10 minutes, sometimes half hour, sometimes, but a great way to stay on top of the news. If you need another good place and a way to stay on top of the news, you can check out our good friend Brandon Sutton. His podcast, Discourse. Brandon Sutton, you can also be heard here. Brandon, getting too cute with the intro. Brandon Sutton joins us from New York City, the host of the Discourse podcast. Brandon, what's up?
Nothing much. You should have kept it simple, though.
I know. I got so excited to have such a big name guest like yourself, and I wanted to be cool with how I introduced you, that our listeners are like, I know Brandon, and I wanted to surprise them with you joining us. So I guess the surprise is over. Thank you for joining us.
No, it's my pleasure. It's always a great time, to join the guys, join the fellas, join for a little chat.
Well, we needed your help. America needs a little chat right now, and specifically right-wing white nationalists. I know, Brandon, you've always had a good pulse on the people out there in the United States, and there's been quite a bit of backlash to the nationwide protest. We have seen car attacks on protesters in Portland and Virginia, New Mexico militia members targeting nonviolent protesters looking to tear down a statue of a 15th century Spanish conquistador, and NASCAR fans feeling a bit helpless after the Confederate battle flag was banned from NASCAR events. Brandon, it feels like Americans, some of them are really struggling in this moment, especially those who are looking for a Eurocentric white American dream. What are you making of the moment and the backlash to the social progress and social movements taken to the streets, but this backlash that we're seeing across the U.S. to it?
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm hopeful. I see that people are still in the streets protesting in favor of defunding the police, abolishing the police, or at the very least giving the police, a more comprehensive and thorough look than they were prior to the protests, right? So not everyone's taking to the streets, but I think everyone's eyes were or are still on the police. And, and that leads to a lot of potential for activists who have been working to sort of curb the police state for a long time to, mobilize it into actual actions, pressure to legislators to reduce their power. In terms of the backlash, I think there's two forms of backlash here, right? We have the backlash against the very idea of protesting, which I think has become a more or less, standard position put forth by the media, put forth by some of the social justice industrial complex, nonprofit industrial complex class, where it's like, okay, protesting is only okay if it's sanctioned by the right organization, sanctioned by the police, sanctioned by, Democratic Party, Republican Party, what have you, who are, so we've seen just a cultural lack of appreciation for what protesting, what marches, what rallies are capable of. And, at the low end of the scale and the high end of the scale, you've seen states try to legalize making it, running over protesters who are marching on the road legal with your car, right? So we've seen, attacks on the freedom to protest and the value to protest for a long time. And on the other hand, we have like the actual backlash against the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have to tell you, again, I expected it to be worse, right? I expected there to be more people on the side of the police. I expected the governments of various cities, municipalities, states, et cetera, to sort of like buckle under the weight of the police union, of their police chiefs, of their, legal systems. But I think a lot of them are seeing this as an opportunity to sort of curtail a lot of that power that was centralized there prior to it. So, it's a time for a lot of possibilities that, that's both scary and, promising, I guess, I suppose.
Yeah. Jamarl, let me ask you, I was at the Texas State House there in Austin, and I was there to just take some photos, see the State House working on a project, and I happened to be there on the swearing-in day for the white supremacist local chapter, whatever group it was, but it was remarkable. A bunch of white dudes in khakis with white shirts, seemingly with their parents around them, giving hate speeches and talking about, in part, about how they had won America. They battled the Native Americans. Their great ancestors came over here and they won America, and they were distraught that now they're being told to share with the gays, to be shared with the blacks and the Hispanics and Jewish people. They thought it was ridiculous. Why do they have to give it back after they fought hard and won it? And it makes me just wonder, like, are these people just throwing hissy fits, Jamal? Is it white fragility? And how dangerous are they? Because in part, it's like, all right, these are just a bunch of bros who have nothing better to do looking for camaraderie. But then we continue to see these militias at state houses. Here, we talked about the other day about in Albuquerque, they had announced, basically had arrested a former city council member because he was part of a militia who had shot and wounded a man at a protest. And Jamal, you kind of wonder, like, when do these things escalate, or why haven't they escalated? I'm curious, can you get inside the head of these kind of white right-leaning militia members and these protesters? Are they out there to actually escalate and create real violence and damage, or do you think they're just kind of all talk?
So some of them are all talk. By the same token, some of the ones that are all talk can inspire people who are not. And whether they're necessarily dangerous from an overt standpoint, like a federal government standpoint, I don't think so. I do think in pockets where they may get somebody who is by themselves and hang them from a tree, like some of these other people who've been caught hanging from a tree, or that yahoo of nutcases that ends up shooting the guy in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I mean, it not to mention, they've developed this kind of weird thing of riding into protesters as this kind of weird protests, like experiential protests. It's utterly obscene. I want to talk about something, though, that you mentioned. They won America. I love that. Won America. We murdered the Native Americans. We enslaved the blacks, and now we have to give it all back. Look, the key point is, if you're going to make the argument that you won America, you're basically making the argument that there is no such thing as morality. There's no such thing as integrity, right, wrong. It's just all dependent upon this kind of game space where nothing matters other than your ability to dominate. What that means, though, is if you get dominated, then that is also fair game, and you can't whine about it after. So I do think in some pockets these guys are dangerous, especially if they can get people alone. The catch becomes, I don't think they want anything. I think at the end of the day, they're going to fundamentally lose it all. Brandon, when you're looking at all of the protests and everything else, we've been asking people this question. How have you been processing all of this? Like, we've gotten people who were doctors, we've gotten people who were part of the activist movement. From your vantage point on your show, as you're looking out the world and you're perusing news and whatnot, and you're seeing social media and the media talk about all this stuff, not to mention you might be at the protests yourself. How do you feel about this particular moment, and what do you think is going to become of this moment?
Well, from my perspective, I have been at the protest, and I try not to adopt a position that I don't think suits me. But I mean, I'm not an organizer. I don't consider myself to be an activist or what I do activism. Insofar that I do engage in that sort of thing, I do it separately, not separately from my, show or whatever, but I encompass it within my show as sort of the primary vantage point I'm taking it from. I'm participating in these protests. I'm not the sort of the anthropologist sitting there to observe from the outside as though I have no stakes in it. And I think that but however, I actually think that's the appropriate way to look at it. I think just generally speaking, I see people taking to the streets. I see people with various motives taking to the streets. And by various motives, I mean people who are along the spectrum of what they think the problem is. I don't know how deep they think it goes or what they think the solution is, but they're taking to the streets in pursuit of trying to, make some sort of statement about the problem. And that to me is the first step. That's the first step to becoming radicalized. That's the first step to gaining a deeper appreciation or better contextualizing what's going on. And it's also the first step to understanding that the stakes of what we're talking about, the police state, the erosion of our civil liberties in pursuit of giving more power to corporations, the military, to various forms of unelected institutions, right, are damaging to our society as a whole and damaging to everyone within our society. I think right now, we discuss like the police state issue from a paradigm of like, well, it's a problem for Black people. It's a problem for, the Black community, for the poor, if you're getting clever, like impoverished community. What we really need to understand is that the police occupy a very specific role in our society. And that's probably a lot of specific roles for a lot of specific people. But the overall cost of having a kinetic, reactionary criminal justice system is one that is incredibly deleterious to everyone's quality of life. It's like there is no other country in the world where, well, at least in the developed world, that the police are allowed to behave the way that they behave, and yet we are still capable of having this conversation. Problem is cordoned off to one community of one small subpopulation, when really that subpopulation is in many ways just the canary in the coal mine for a lot of what the sort of the water or climate riots are going to look like in 40, 50 years. So I think it's incumbent upon everybody. It's what I've been communicating to people on my show that, you know what, you might not think Black Lives Matter affects you personally. You'd be wrong, but you'd be wrong to think that, that these protests don't affect you, but you might think that. So let me explain to you how it affects you personally. Let me explain to you, you don't think that the police are going to be mobilized against people asking for clean water in 30 years or 40 years, whatever.
No, I totally hear you. I mean, and Brandon, I feel like it's even on top of that. It's like you need to basically recondition people to not be so reactionary, even to get that space to talk to people, because people are so quick to rush and feel affronted and offended by anything that's put out in front of them. We can look no farther than what's happened at NASCAR over the past couple of weeks. Last week, we talked about on the show here, Bubba Wallace debuted a Black Lives Matter car with an image of two fists, one black and one white, gripping each other on the hood with the words compassion, love, understanding wrapped around the bumper. Well, following that on Sunday at a NASCAR Xfinity race in Homestead, Florida, driver Kyle Weatherman debuted a newly designed car emblazoned with the hashtag Back the Blue in support of police and first responders. The hood of Weatherman's Camaro bore the thin blue line flag, an emblem of the Blue Lives Matter organization, a national group of police and their supporters originally formed to counter the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a interesting story on a few different ends. One, the fact that the Richard Petty Motorsports, Bubba Wallace's team there, would roll out the Black Lives Matter car. That's not Richard Petty's MO whatsoever. And many people are basically saying, kind of like Jamal, what you were saying earlier, the NFL looked and the Nike looked to commoditize and make money off of Colin Kaepernick. In many ways, it seems like Richard Petty Motorsports, looking for a financial boost, said, you know what, let's go with the wins and promote Black Lives Matter and try to make some money off of this racial kind of social movement. And then to have this backlash now, Brandon Sutton, with Weatherman planting the thin blue line flag, which basically somehow again pits Black Lives Matter solely against the police, when Black Lives Matter has been pretty vocal about the larger issues of racism and capitalism throughout all of society.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to at least address like what role the police serve, or at least what role people sort of ascribe to the police. And it has very little to do with like preventing crime or punishing criminals. A lot of what role the police serve, and this is, I mentioned this stuff about, NASCAR, right, is that it's like they're meant to control of a population of outsiders. What makes those people outsiders, really depends. Sometimes it's their class, sometimes it's their race, sometimes it's their XYZ. But like they're meant to prevent this influx of outsiders into the wrong communities, into the wrong schools, into the wrong, whatever, and keep them cordoned off into bad neighborhoods. And those how those neighborhoods are bad because they're occupied by the police. And that justifies defunding them, that justifies whatever violence goes on there that's, perpetuated either by the state or, deemed as permissible by the state. And so when you talk something like NASCAR, which I would argue is at least portrayed culturally as a traditionally white, traditionally Southern, kind of space, that any sort of influx of Black Lives Matter material is going to be looked at as a affront to like the cultural values, the social order of that space. It's supposed to you're supposed to be keeping politics out of the sport. You're supposed to be keeping politics out of, these sort of theoretically apolitical bastions. But, when you say something like, okay, well, Black Lives Matter, the fact that the police shouldn't be murdering people in the streets is not really an issue of politics and in like sort of the left. It shouldn't be an issue of politics. It should be an issue of like, hey, civil rights, civil liberties, at least not politics in the way that we understand them to be. So, I think that we're going to have a lot of these circumstances where we see, Black Lives Matter or, more gestures towards inclusivity into traditionally like white deemed spaces of media or like hobby spaces or, sports be, actively resisted by participants who I would argue probably think that they're anti-racist or like not anti-racist, but at least they don't think of themselves as racist or being against Black lives. They just want to contextualize, they just want you they just want to use the context of reacting to Black Lives Matter with some sort of antagonism, whether it be a Blue Lives Matter flag or with like Make America Great or, keep politics out of, my NASCAR, as though like that's not enough evidence that they have some kind of antagonism towards the very underlying of like, well, Black equality. We're talking about equality under the law.
Yeah. It's almost like there's a knee-jerk reaction, almost like for example, the statues. When they were talking about pulling the statues down, I had a knee-jerk reaction like, whoa, those statues have been up there forever. Why are you messing with the statues? Now, we're talking about Confederate statues of people who wanted to keep me as a slave. So it takes a certain reorganization of your thinking to realize that, well, my knee-jerk reaction is from the thing of familiarity and that these were horrible people in the context of what they were trying to accomplish. Yeah, maybe that statue shouldn't be there. Or at the very least, you shouldn't be seen with certain references. You should be seen with shame. It's a weird thing for your society to immediately change its point of view on a whim. Not just whites, by the way, blacks, in regards to the polling that had taken place. I want to ask you about the NASCAR thing, because there's something weird to me about the NASCAR thing, even ironic. If you think about slave patrols and this notion of going after African Americans, a commodity that couldn't necessarily access its own value, with legs that had sense enough to know it was a commodity that couldn't access its value and ran away, you had these cops of their day basically getting these guys and either dragging them back to their owners. It's weird to me, massively ironic, that someone puts out Black Lives Matter, and typically they would put out a Confederate sign, and they're doing this to push back against a Confederate sign, and they're putting out a thin blue line. What is this animosity that people think is there as if cops are the opposite of black? How bizarre is that? And do they fully get what they're really saying, the indications that they're given? Because basically they're protesting a Confederate sign being put up, basically using a cop sign to supplant the Confederate sign. That is a horrible, horrible look.
I mean, yeah, it's obviously, it's obvious that some people are just in search of symbols to replace ones that they were, that were taken away from them. It goes back to your point about that everyone who comes to these, rallies, these Unite the Right rallies, the sort of Second Amendment protest rallies, are they all dangerous? Are they all there to start trouble in the classical, like neo-Nazi white supremacist sense? Or are some of them just like wrapped up in whatever like nonsense surface level like argument is being, on to like inflame enough people to make it seem like the issue is deep enough in these people's heads to like justify the way they're behaving. And I think we have to start really being better able to target like where these sort of leaders, when it comes to like coded responses to Black Lives Matter, are. Who is sowing this disinformation? Like who is conditioning people to want to start using Blue Lives Matter? Like where is this stuff coming from? And how can we better combat it amongst the people who are winnable? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about people in the streets who otherwise wouldn't be there. We're talking about people who are coming to terms with, or rather, coming to accept Black Lives Matter as a movement who otherwise would, who didn't 7 months ago, 7 years ago, who did 7 weeks ago. So we need to understand that, for the most part, as people who have, self-actualized ideology, who are so reflexive about that, who are, conscious, who have broken down the veils of the false reality constructed by the media, that there's a whole swath of people out there who are winnable, but we're not the only people who are vying for them. We're not the only people.
I was just going to add to that. Yeah, I think it's remarkable. Again, my biggest challenge with these protests is that I'm so close to them that each protest over the last 7-8 years that I've been involved in covering them as a journalist and been a part of some of them, is that it's really hard to understand if it's going to have a larger cultural shift to it, because it all feels the same to me right now, right? I bike down the hill. It's 2.5 miles from me. I join the protest. I take videos. I talk to people, and then I come back up the hill from downtown Washington, D.C. It's harder to know if it is having that larger impact. And I think that is quite remarkable to see what's happening at NASCAR and even Fox News. And I want to play this clip, Brandon, because I think it is fascinating here. It's not satisfying by any means, basically the outcome of the clip and the lies that are told. But in the clip here, you're going to hear an exchange between Fox and Friends co-host Brian Kilmeade and the acting Department of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and they talk about systemic racism. They are going to deny that it exists, but the mere fact they bring it up, I thought, was quite remarkable. Here's that clip. Have a listen.
A lot on your plate, just the nature of your job. But in the stats you have seen, in the research you have done, and anecdotes that have been told to you, have you found that there is systematic racism in law enforcement?
No, and I get asked about this a lot, systemic racism in law enforcement. And what that says to me is that individuals that believe that we have designed a system to install racist beliefs into our law enforcement officers. And that's simply not true. I think the vast majority of law enforcement out there do not hold any racist beliefs, and they're tired of being told that they're racist time and time again. We have a number of law enforcement officers that are African American, that are Asian, that are Hispanic. And what does that say? Are we calling them systemic racist as well?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess we are, Jamal. I guess that's where we're getting to here.
Yes,
Let me
we
first
are.
say that
implicit
the DHS
racism is
secretary,
not a color thing. That's even among blacks. I mean, they've done
yeah,
studies
well,
on
let me
that
say
stuff.
that here, because that he's lying there. The DHS secretary saying that is a lie. Michigan State University psychologist Joseph Cesario and other researchers looked at police killings in 2015 and found that the race of a police officer did not predict the race of the citizen shot. In other words, black officers were just as likely to shoot black citizens as white officers were. Brandon, regardless of the fact Trump had little substance to say yesterday at his press conference, the fact Fox News will deny the existence of systemic racism, the mere fact that they've had to talk about these issues seems like a pretty big win for the Black Lives Matter movement.
I mean, I guess, right? So, I'm always apprehensive about this sort of thing as well, because, it's very easy for a lot of energy to be turned into a lot of nothing, to be co-opted by various, parties who are, who see people in the street not as a hopeful thing, but as a frightening thing, because it's challenging to like the current status quo, right? So, we know the relationship that the Democratic Party, Republican Party has when it comes to stuff like this, and it's a codependent one. The Republican Party will come out and they'll deny the existence of something like systemic racism or sexism or climate change. And, that'll feed their base. And the Democratic Party will acknowledge you're using all the right words, so that systemic racism exists, climate change exists, that they listen to scientists, that sexism is real, that women make X amount of money for every dollar men make. And then when you ask, like, what is their comprehensive plan to solve that, sort of like, they kind of just like them up. Because in this dynamic of the two-party system, it's simply enough to acknowledge that something exists without actively trying to solve it in any real comprehensive way, because the other party just simply won't even acknowledge its existence. So, they definitely exist in that paradigm. But also, just listening to that cop's definition and understanding of systemic racism, it's like it kind of hammers home something I've been thinking for the past few weeks when it comes to stuff like this. Where despite people using the phrase systemic racism, despite people using words like systemic, they don't really understand what it means, and a part of that is strategic. I think part of it just has become just like class and labor issues have been erased from the vocabulary of the American people and from our history in our sort of theory of political change. It's systemic issues. It seems to be sort of the dominant theory of how systemic issues work, or how systemic racism works, is that everyone's just a little bit racist, and then some people are a little bit more racist, and whenever you have a cop shooting, it's just because that cop is a little bit more racist than your average person, or you have something like the cops, you just articulate with there's just a top-down system of racists who make all the other cops racist. And I guess are you saying that black cops can be racist? Are you saying that Asian cops can be racist? It's these are questions that I would think that if we were a society seriously engaging with racism and sexism and classism and just general inequality, there would be questions you wouldn't be asking earnestly, because the answers are so prepared. No, that's not how racism works. That's not what people are saying when they're saying that the police are an example of systemic racism. Like what they're saying is that, you know, the history of the police is one founded on like the very act of catching slaves, right? That's what they exist to do. And that in their current incarnation, they still more or less serve the same function of protecting capital, preserving private property, ensuring that the wrong people don't enter the right neighborhoods, like policing the boundaries of whiteness, policing the boundaries of class. And so, like, until we're able to, I think, until we confront the fact that so much of this like education or this language or this just general tools for understanding the complexity of the problems around us have been just taken from us, we have to, like, we're going to have ourselves struggling to talk to just people about like what's going on. Like, it's so hard to talk to people about what's going on because like their just understanding of things is in many ways been blunted by education system and political media class that does not value critical thinking or individuality in the classical sense.
Brandon, I so agree with you, and it's unfortunate. I mean, you have, for example, and I guess there are a few points. Yes, there may be some cops that are explicitly racist, but as you said, the argument about structural racism is not necessarily that each individual cop is racist. It's more so that we instantiated a system in place at the point where, as those white Americans say, we won, that basically instantiated an underclass. The income gap between blacks and whites haven't necessarily changed. And it's not magic of what those things happen. It's clearly understood. Even the drug war, even going beyond this notion of going after slaves per se, Nixon explicitly started the drug war to lock up blacks and hippies. His con man, Ehrlichman, made the point. He said, did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. They did it because they wanted political ends. Now, does that have consequences going forward? Of course it has consequences going forward. Think of all of those people that were thrown into prison because Nixon wanted to make that political weapon. And think of the people who made it worse, like Joe Biden, who made these drug laws longer and everything else. It was utterly obscene. I guess my point is the honesty of it is always missing to me. Meaning, Tim Kaine gave a really rousing speech yesterday. And Tim Kaine went into slavery and Jim Crow and redlining and how you had businesses, housing areas, economic areas, all of these things were ensconced with discrimination over the years, going all the way up into like the 90s. And then it's kind of like the climate change argument, right? Well, if you agree with that, if you agree with me that the world is going to be utterly and entirely destroyed, that human life itself is going to be put at peril and risk, then how do you walk away and then become God of Oil Obama? Like, it's such a weird, calm thing. So if you are arguing to me about slavery and whatnot, okay, what's your solution? Are you going to pass reparations? If not, why are you having this level of in this tenor of an argument? Do you get sick of them doing that? Like, it's almost like you're stuck with the guy who acknowledges reality but doesn't do anything about it versus the guy who just says it doesn't exist.
I mean, yeah, I think that encapsulates what our political system is. Like we're stuck between people who don't acknowledge the existence of basic facts and people who, acknowledge the existence of basic facts but pretend as though like there's nothing we can do to change them. People who want to acknowledge the existence of racism but take it under the fatalistic approach of like, okay, well, the best we can do is make sure there's an equal amount of like suffering amongst the poorest and an equal amount of like incredibly extravagant unnecessary wealth amongst broken up racially by the richest. That's the Democrat solution that's a liberal solution too to the racism problem. We have 13% of billionaires be black, 51% of billionaires be women, and it's not the end goal of like anti-racism or feminism. It's it's a reasonable or important mid-step. And so I find myself like being nicer to people who don't know, like being nicer to like the everyday average person who may be confused by like the term prison abolition, who may be confused by like the what systemic racism entails, and like having to parse that out for them, and a lot less sympathetic and a lot less friendly to people who are like actively out there sowing disinformation. Because I think that we have to be wary of engaging in analyses that don't actively essentially incorporate into them. They're like, hey, there are people out there like the 8 Can't Wait people, like the Obamas, like the Clintons, like the Democratic Party establishment, who are actively trying to take all this energy and do something wrong with it. Do something, make sure it doesn't actually pan out to something. And that has to be something we, consider as we move forward. Who is actively trying to derail progress? And, why do we view them as people who can be worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. Figuring out who is the people that you actually can move forward with things. I'm curious here, Brandon Sutton, as we have to let you go here in a second, your thought of Quaker dropping Aunt Jemima image there on its famous syrup after they said after it says here the story, after recognizing they are based on a racial stereotype. And I just thought the usage of the word recognizing to Quaker, they just looked at it and were like, what? Wait a second, I never saw it like that as problematic. Who would have thought here?
We never noticed that this was an issue.
They're finally recognizing it. It's quite hysterical to me. I mean, what about these big corporations, Brandon? I mean, it seems like Nike and even the NFL and others are saying, yeah, we were totally wrong. Colin Kaepernick, right? Quaker. Yeah, I guess those people writing us those letters over the years, turns out they were right this whole time. I mean, again, same with the corporations out there. How do we figure out who is to be worked with and who can't be?
I mean, worked with it, I think, is the wrong way to conceive of it, right? I think that, some people get caught up in, wondering if Amazon puts out a Black Lives Matter memo or if, Wendy's puts out a Black Lives Matter memo, does that somehow devalue or detract? Was that something to concern yourself with? But from my perspective, as long as they're not making any demands, they're not making any demands of the movement or anything, then it doesn't really matter per se, right? It just means that they're buckling, or rather that they're making the calculation. There are enough people now to make a sizable impact on their profit if they choose to stay silent than there would be if they chose to speak out. So, that's good, right? That just means public opinion is shifting, and they're seeing that public opinion shift, and they're reacting accordingly. At the same time, though, when it comes to stuff like Aunt Jemima, I'm ambivalent, but undeniably funny because whenever something like this happens, like with Nike or Ninja Blenders or whatever, you get a bunch of weirdos who just don't ever think about or use the product that much before talking about. I'm talking about Blenders Keurig, and they're gonna buy a gallon bottle worth of Aunt Jemima syrup and just drink the whole thing, into some sort of weird hyperglycemic shock just to prove just because it makes freedom or something. It's they're trying to prove some point. But it's funny. It's funny when Lego says they're not going to sell cop toys anymore. You have a 47-year-old dude who's just well, I love Legos, but now I guess I won't be buying anymore. Okay, dude, let's whatever.
No, it's the same. I love the people after the Kaepernick Nike thing burning their Nike shoes, and it's consumerism just wins at the end of the day, right? They don't care as long as you're just buying shoes and wasting your money. They're happy you're burning those right now, and now you're down a pair of shoes. So I guess the joke's on you, Brandon Sutton. Thank you so much for joining us here on Political Misfits. Brandon Sutton is the host of the Discourse podcast. Brandon, where can people find the podcast and more of your work online?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Pretty Bad Lefty, and you can find the podcast, The Discourse, on all major podcast platforms: SoundCloud, iTunes, Spotify. It's people are taking a listen. They like it. You might not, but if you do, you can feel free to support Black creatives like myself and my co-host.
Very cool. Greatly appreciated. Brandon Sutton, Discourse Podcast. We turn to a quick break before we come back with our weekly Revelations segment. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, and just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, the show that goes against the grain. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with Bob Spaceman Bob Schluber.
Schlehuber. It's a rough name today,
like, it's weird. In my head, at that moment, it just was like, you can't say this word. It's Bob Spaceman Schlehuber.
There we go.
Nailed it. You can hear the change in that music. It's Wednesday. That means it's revelations, the strange, the odd, the weird, and the ethereally profound. As always, you can join the conversation with chats, tweets, or give us a call at 202-521-1320. Bob, pop quiz. How many intelligent communicating civilizations are there in our galactic backyard?
See, I'm a maybeist, Jamal. Everything's a maybe for me, so I can't even guess at a number because whatever it is, it might be 0, it might be 1,000. So you're gonna have to tell me what your guess is.
Oh, I already know the number. Throw a number out. Right. Give me your. You can use the Drake equation. You can use whatever you want. What's your?
Well, I guess it's like I don't like the question because at the end of it there could be 0, and it's all just a figment of our imagination and the Matrix, and we're plugged into a machine right now.
Now,
so
here's the thing,
I can't even guess at it.
Well, but here's the thing. If indeed the number is 0, that would mean that would be profound, because that would mean that all of this universe out here, and you have more galaxies than grains of sand on every beach on Earth. It would be really bizarre if the qualifications for life only developed on Earth. That would almost.
But don't you see it like I always see it like the end of Men in Black, either the first or second one, where it's just us. We're just a marble in somebody else's game, and so all of the endless galaxy. So if you're asking me scientifically, based on what we have, I would say there's 4,000 other life forms or intelligent beings out there in the galaxy.
36. Uber specific. According to the study in University of Nottingham published in the latest Astrophysical Journal, there were a minimum of 36 communicating species in the galaxy. So specific. Love it. But indeed, scientists have calculated that there could be a minimum of 36 active communicating intelligent civilizations in our Milky Way galaxy. However, due to time and distance, we may never actually know if they ever existed at all. This gets to your point. It's like, if you don't know it, how do you know what you don't know? The Nottingham scientists use a new approach to calculate the answer. One that uses more specific, simple, and direct assumptions about how life forms, including that the life forms in a scientific way. No duh. But it's this part that I love, that you would think would just be intuitive, but scientists apparently had a hard time coming to it. This keeps them from falling down the rabbit hole of unanswerable questions. The equation took into account the history of star formation in our galaxy, the age of our stars, the metal content in our stars, and the likelihood of stars hosting Earth-like planets in their habitable zones where life could form. Most critical, of course, is the presence of the habitable zone. How stable the stars have been and for how long is crucial. Basically, you need an area where life can grow. The study assumes that it would take roughly 5 billion years for intelligent life to form on other planets. This is based logically on the amount of time it took here on Earth. The study also calculated that civilization's technological evolution would last for 100 years, again, rationally, much like what took place on Earth. And by the way, it's just a guess. You could have something that develops faster than that. You may have a civilization that develops in a way or in an area where these metrics just don't count. It's just an estimate based on us. Whatever we find at this point based on these calculations will be something similar to us. In addition to 4.5 billion years to evolve on Earth before they became capable of communicating. These numbers, I love these numbers. The study does throw in that the current distance between us and the 36 communicating civilizations is around 17,000 light years away. 1 light year being the distance it takes for light to travel in 1 year. Fantastic speeds, but the distances are so vast that it just becomes mind-boggling. This will make communication and detection very improbable, the study says. Now, the part about that I like is very specific on the number. But we'll add in that will make communication very possible because of the distance. It's not the distance, not the distance. It's your technological capabilities. That's the issue. If those species are indeed communicating, they're doing so in a way that goes beyond Newtonian physics, and for that matter, has to find something beyond what we know as physics in and of itself. Especially since the light distances are so long. Think about how long it would take when we send a probe, I don't know, to Pluto, if we send the probe to, let's say, Jupiter. And the probe would have to be in the right spot. It would have to be in line of, near Earth, or at the very least line of sight. It would take minutes, forever. It takes light 8 minutes just to get from Earth to the sun. If somebody, let's say a destroyer of worlds, blew up our sun, we will not know until 8 minutes, because it would take light to travel to 8 minutes for everybody to be like, oh God, the sun is gone. Well, these distances are mind-boggling, but again, it depends on your technological development. If you had a drive that could get you from point A to point B faster, then you can get there faster. Again, technological development. If you had a capacity to go from one star system to another, it is very possible that you have ways of communicating because of your level of physics that go beyond just the typical way of going through or transiting through space. Bob, what do you have to say? Now, do you buy this study, or you think these guys are feeling themselves with a certain degree of hubris predicting this super specific number like this?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Again, as a maybeist, as somebody who believes in infinite different possibilities, I think Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one of my favorite movies. I struggle with these.
What's the secret of life?
Tomorrow.
42.
The different segments, they always contradict and interfere with one another, because it's like, are there UFOs? Is it us? Is it not? And then if it's not us, that means somebody has physics and have figured out how to fly much faster at different rates and speeds than we are able to come up with any of our math. So our math is clearly then outdated.
Yeah.
We also know there could be parallel universes. So how many different intelligent beings exist in the other parallel universe that's coexisting with us right now? How do we actually, it's like there's so many, I never know what to do with these, because I'm always left with more questions, because we have so many different unanswered that are kind of in separate tracks, but
they don't contradict though. That's the important part.
Okay.
Like, if you think about it, they don't. Like, if you're saying, okay, they're UFOs. Well, these guys are saying they're 36 communicating galaxies. Well, that doesn't contradict at all. That actually is
No, but if we're saying that the UFO has greater science and physics knowledge than we do.
Yeah, it would have to, by definition.
Rely on our physics knowledge and our science to actually understand what's happening in the universe. If there's a greater being out there that better comprehends it, who are we to say what's happening when we clearly understand that somebody else knows it better?
Well, you have nobody else to guide you. Like, if you were playing chess and you were rated 1500, the best you can do is the best move that you can do. It's not, you have a logic to it, and at some point when that move is a disaster, you learn better to not make that move. Civilization is no different. We have a Chinese finger trap that we're trying to extricate ourselves out of, and each species on this planet has that same
when you
thing.
make that move, but when you make that move, you find out pretty quickly whether you were right or wrong, if it was disastrous. I guess I don't know what to do with these guys' number, because it's not like we do now raise your hand, intelligence beings, and we count and there's 40. And then oh, sorry guys, you're off by 4. How do we know if these people are right or wrong?
No, I agree.
There's no way to check them.
The super specific number is nonsense. So I agree with you on that front. I'm just enamored that he would venture to guess at all. Like the Drake equation and everything else. Look, my thing is, I don't think it's us. I think there is something else that has the capacity to visit this planet. And why not? Ultimately, we're trying to visit Mars. We're trying to visit all of these other planets ourselves. It just so happened to almost be ingrained in us to do so. So it doesn't necessarily blow me away. It also, for me, has to invoke God for there not to be anything else, because it would be super weird. One of the key points that he made in the study was life forms when it has the opportunity to form, period. And I'm like, no duh. But for them, they were like, yeah, maybe that's the case. Keep in mind, there's life forming in volcanic pits. That's astonishing. Anywhere life gets the opportunity to form, it forms, it grows. And so, let's say you had a civilization that was 1 billion years ahead of us. What does that physics look like? Let's say you have a civilization that's not 1 billion years ahead of us, but was united, didn't have this wars and nonsense, wouldn't even know what a policeman is. You know what I mean? It can be organized differently, and within the context of that organized being differently, you end up with different civilizations, not to mention the way they look, the things that they do, all that stuff. I just find it
I guess I
amazing.
always just struggle. I just was challenging my mother, who's a Christian, and on her beliefs in God, and she looked at me. She goes, "But Bob, who created God?" And my mind blew in that moment.
Right.
So again, where it's like, we might have 36 intelligent beings out here, but who created all of this, or how did they get here? So there's always seemingly always going to be the unknown until it's known. I don't
Also,
know.
you
Sounds
made a
like
really good point about
Rumsfeld
we
there.
can be plugged into a machine. Now, here's the thing: when physicists are looking at our system, and you make a point of saying, okay, well, if this was a material reality, meaning this is a physical desk, this is the thing, but the reality of it is, when you're really looking at the basics of it, it's empty space. We interpret the stuff in these particular ways, but in real terms, it's empty space. And if nobody is watching it, it's not there at all. So it's like the material universe thing is somewhat challenged by a lot of the physics stuff. Like, even when you get into this notion of double slit, it shouldn't act that way. It just shouldn't respond that way. Like a physical universe, there would be no strangeness with it. The way the light, the electron goes through one or the other, because it goes through one or the other. It's a solid object. Like, we have a lot of, I think, and part of the thing that I am hopeful about, that if these guys say, yes, they're UFOs, that these scientists immediately, when they're looking at this stuff, it's not, okay, we don't know how many out there, we just know they're out there. And we know they have to get here somehow. And they start thinking of themselves of the equations and everything else. If I told you, all right, Bob, there's a way to mate. There's mate in 10. You will look for that for hours trying to find that mate in 10, as opposed to me saying, all right, there may or may not be a mate here. Well, you may not look at all. You might get sick of looking after a while. It's the same thing with the scientists. The moment that you tell them, yes, there's an answer to this question that somebody found out, oh man, your science is going to go through the roof.
Yeah, incredible stuff tomorrow. We have to turn to a break. We got to find a new name for this revelation segment. I always feel like I know less after it. So
really, are you serious?
I was like, wait, I have more questions now.
But that's a good thing.
I'll bring it. We'll talk more about it tomorrow.
Yeah. But questions are always the basis of knowledge.
Let's take a quick break and get into a few more stories before we head out of here for today. One last break here. You listen to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in DC. We're back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. News, politics, and culture without red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Shilley over here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. A few stories we wanted to fit in here so you don't miss anything. We're out of here at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, but don't tune out. You have By Any Means Necessary up after us, followed by Loud and Clear and the Critical Hour By Any Means Necessary from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Jamarl, I want to jump into a horrific story, the trauma caused here by U.S. imperialism abroad, continuing to find itself into the news 13 years later. I want to talk a little bit about the July 12, 2017 Baghdad air strike, the collateral murder video that became famous around the world through its relationship with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Dean Yates, Reuters Baghdad bureau chief at the time the events of the collateral murder video took place, spoke over the weekend about being lied to by the U.S. military authorities regarding the murder of two of his Iraqi colleagues. In 2007, two Iraqi Reuters employees were gunned down without provocation by a U.S. military helicopter, a fact that the U.S. tried to deny for years, including repeatedly lying to Yates about the incident, trying to paint the Reuters staffers as militants, or acting suspiciously as somehow responsible for their own murders. In an interview with The Guardian published over the weekend, Yates spoke about the years of PTSD and trauma he endured as a result of that concerted manipulation. He's now come to the defense of Julian Assange, who helped make the video of that murder public. what he did was 100% an act of truth-telling, exposing to the world what the war in Iraq looks like and how the U.S. military lied, Yates said. Yates also told the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that trying to parse whether Assange is or is not a journalist misses the point. Yates said, "My view is that there's a process to journalism. The gathering, checking, rechecking of source material, verifying the material, presenting that material to an audience in a context and in a way that's digestible and a way that potentially does not put anyone's safety at risk. So I don't think Julian is a journalist, but I think that misses the point in Trump's America. If they put Julian on trial and jail him and he faces up to 175 years, that would set a shocking precedent for going after anyone of any nationality, mind you, who accesses or publishes classified material that is in the public interest. You could be an unknown hacker living in New Zealand, or you could be in the New York Times. The chilling effect that the jailing of Julian Assange could have on whistleblowing and investigative reporting is something that the world, I think, really needs to be very much aware of. That's why I support bringing Julian home to Australia." That's Dean Yates. Jamal, I just want to ask you, let me ask a simple question here. What's the point? What was the point of it all? To kill these people, to ruin Dean Yates's life, to then lie about it, to now go after Julian Assange for what? And I don't think there's an answer to just jump ahead of you.
I think, like most things, I think it's just the incentives that the individuals are following, what they consider to be their best play, if that makes sense. Like, for example, you have a situation where the United States is in Iraq. While in Iraq, they end up murdering a Reuters agent who was walking around in Iraq. There was no cause for that murder, and that's exactly what it was. Now, then you had people, like you say, hide and pretend like we weren't responsible and whatnot, and then go after Julian Assange. Now, the thing about Assange, I think, has more to do with Trump and Russia stuff, where Donald Trump was called a Putin puppet and everything else, and Julian Assange was in part one of his ways of showing that he wasn't a Putin puppet. I think Trump took several actions like that. I mean, if you look at the foreign policy thing, taking away the missile treaties, this kind of John Bolton stuff. If you look at going after allies like Iran, well, he had a hard-on for Iran regardless, but definitely in Venezuela, where, again, friend of Russia. Like, it was one act after the next that Donald Trump took. It looked like almost seemingly to push back on this notion that him and Putin were somehow working together. So any notion of a friendship between the two was utterly destroyed. Beyond that, I don't think, unfortunately, there was a larger point. I know that sounds horrible because some people might think that, may feel more comfortable if there was order in the world, even if it was a bad order. But no, I think this was all of these just kind of side ancillary incentives that just kind of added up to what this is.
Yeah, you always kind of wonder, is it just the fog machine on full blast trying to obscure all of the actions of the U.S. abroad? And then you kind of wonder, each of these individual parts of people making these little micro decisions oftentimes just kind of lose a larger picture and how they fit together, that I think you just kind of slide down these slippery slopes where you don't really quite understand what's taking place, and then we commit these horrific crimes that nobody's ever accountable to them, and obviously nobody wants to be accountable because you're committing crimes and violent acts of murder that they have to then hide, and so make sure people can't get back to the streets and can't protest and actually speak out against these.
It honestly is worse than that, though, when you put it in context. I mean, George Bush basically lied himself into a war, and in lying himself into a war, there was no consequence for that. Nancy Pelosi said, "I knew it was a lie." Well, if you knew it was a lie, how can you not turn around and impeach the president that basically killed a million people? And then to make it even worse, Donald Trump will come out and say Obama is guilty, shocking, Obama is guilty of invading the country in order to topple the leadership of the country, basically a coup. Trump will say also, but we're going to keep the oil despite that coup killed 500,000 people. It's utterly astonishing what the country accepts, but we don't care. And I think that's the thing that plagues me about it. There are real people that are being affected. These people are screaming that their rights are being trespassed on because they have to wear a mask. Yeah, what is it like when you have a foreign military that's invading your soil that you want to leave? You tell them to leave and they tell you to kick rocks. It's like, but they don't think about that. They only think in terms of, what's going on here, missing the point, your military and what your government is doing horrendous things abroad.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I do want to pivot here to another story because I talk so often about how unified the Republican Party truly is. So anytime there's some good infighting taking place, I get quite excited here. Get ready for it, Jamal. Donald Trump versus John Bolton.
What?
That's right. That's right. The mustache versus the Cheeto heading to court. The Trump administration yesterday sued former White House National Security Advisor John Bolton in an attempt to block the release of his new book next week. The Department of Justice says it's trying to stop Bolton from compromising national security and claims Bolton never completed a required government review of the book to scrub classified information. Although Bolton did remove some classified information from the manuscript, the National Security Council has determined that whole paragraphs of top secret information remain in the manuscript, according to the lawsuit, and it could thus cause irreparable harm to the U.S. if released. The book was scheduled to be released June 23rd. I don't know if you had pre-ordered that, Jamal. And Bolton has already reportedly been paid $2 million. Simon & Schuster, the publishers, called the lawsuit merely another attempt to block a book that's going to be unflattering to the president.
That's probably going to be true. I mean, God, just think, you fight for getting millions of people killed, and then you turn around and turn it into $2 million. That's great.
Yeah, like, who's Simon & Schuster? So again, it's like, how do you feel about Simon & Schuster giving $2 million to John Bolton? Because on one hand, I do nerd out on political history. It is fascinating to see insider stories. But on the other hand, it's like, stop giving them the resources to kill people and to be horrific human beings.
This goes back to the monologue to some degree, right? It's like we've lost control of our political instrument. And that's terrifying to me for some reason. And that doesn't seem to be a big deal to others. I don't know why.
I don't know why at all. Jamal, I want to get one last story in here. I know it's always a big favorite of our producer, Michelle Whitty. She gets quite excited when you bring up Star Trek. Star Trek, stepping up and doing big things here. Tell us more.
Well, so Star Trek, basically the show, I think it's Picard. Yeah, Picard, actually, the one that's on CBS. Is giving $1 to Black Lives Matter for everyone who tweets hashtag Star Trek. I think it's fun. I put the link at the bottom so everybody can see it for themselves. But basically, anytime you tweet
Star Trek United Gives.
What is it? Star Trek. Here it is. Star Trek United Gives. Hashtag Star Trek United Gives. Every time you tweet that, $1 will be given to Black Lives Matter. It's like, oh, that's so nice. Like they said, together we're going to stand in it and all of this other stuff. You know, the beauty of Star Trek, I know Ms. Whitty thinks these are boring analogies, but this notion of equality and intersectionality, they were already there. Like the first kiss between a black man or a black woman and a man's Kirk kissing a horror. Now, he was forced to do it because they wouldn't allow it on television where it was just the white man kissing a black woman. Oh, too much. So they had the aliens force them to do it. But it was the first time that took place. The definition of a black hole, again, Star Trek. The woman on woman, where you had Trill, a couple in Deep Space Nine. Star Trek took these issues and just took them as our society is going to evolve in this way, so let's just go there. I love it.
Yeah. So in the news here, CBS starting today is streaming what feels like are the 15 most culturally impactful episodes of the series for free. Are they doing another Picard?
Yes.
You did ruin Picard for me.
Yeah. Oh wait, have you seen the last episode?
You ruined the
I can't tell you.
If
you haven't seen the last episode, I can't tell you.
No, you already ruined it. You did tell me in a
then
text.
Yes, there's going to be a new
remember
Picard.
this?
That's going to be a new one.
Yeah, you did. You spoiled it for me. I'm glad you're admitting. So they're going to come back with the second season. What's the future of Picard?
Oh man, I love that first season. It was so euphoric. I mean, because if you've watched Star Trek and you've seen Picard, well, that's Picard as somewhat of an officer. He's strong and everything else. But he has a certain ideology of the world that's grounded in the new generation politics. Next Generation wasn't this place at war and everything else like some of the other seasons. Next Generation, yes, they had their military conflicts and everything else, but they were a vehicle of exploration. Well, Picard, now that he's out, still has that ideology in a world that's darker. And that ideology is rubbing up against this kind of darker world that the Federation exists in. So it was a beautiful episode. I mean, just the season. I love that show. I know some people didn't. I found it profound, especially the notion of getting together, of peace. Like even this notion of threat and danger, where the Romulans had where the machines had a real credible threat, and their actions for it was going to be hostile. And this kind of notion of trying to work through those things. It was really good. I could geek out on that for hours.
Fully endorsed here by Jamal Thomas. We do want to just let our readers know. We're not going to get time to tell the full story, but if you go over to the DW.com, a German outlet, and you want to just ruin your day with the horrifics of the world, Berlin authorities place children with pedophiles for 30 years. Wow. I'll let all of you misfits go out and read that horrific story. We weren't able to get that to that story today that we wanted to share. But Jamar, we are unfortunately out of time. We'll be back with all the stories we can fit into 2 hours tomorrow, 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Big thank you to our guest, Robert Johnson, Jody Bartolo, Dr. Ashen Butt, and Brandon Sutton. Big thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us for the show. The after show. So I will give you guys a heads up on stuff. Wesley Walker, Space Talk. Yes, I love Space Talk too, Wesley Walker. Michelle's not a big fan of it, but I love it. I think it does something to me. Do you know that show? It's a movie, this horrible movie. Valerian something. It's called Valerian though. It's Valerian. God, what is it? I think it may just be called Valerian, but horrible movie. But the opening of it is euphoric. Like it's a religious experience to me almost. It felt like I was high watching it every time. Well, you have this society. They were playing Space Oddity by David Bowie. That in and of itself. Oh, love that song. But then to me, I get it screws with me when a song is really placed like really strongly with a scene to me, and it creates this kind of weird high. But these guys build a space station, and then a little bit more, and a little bit more. And then you get this thing of peace on Earth where all of the races are coming up. They keep their cultural identities, but those cultural identities basically are subordinated to the kind of larger whole, meaning they don't lose who they are in order to kind of come to peace. They shake hands as they go into the station, but then you get first contact. And within first contact, you have this kind of alien species that comes and it shakes hands. And then you have another alien contact and another. And the species get weirder, where they don't even look like human species anymore. And over. And it's this euphoric music of Bowie, this kind of atmospheric music, while all of this kind of space, this contact with humanity as humanity grows up and goes into the galaxy. Oh, it's so awesome. It's so awesome. The movie sucks though. The actors are horrible. That scene, however, is epic. Arlene Chambers took this long for Quaker Oaks to wake up just like Band-Aids. It's right. Bob said that. It was like, you didn't know that character was racist so for like 50 years? The wild part about it is, what happens is, though, Brandon is right. It's not so much that they wake up to it. It's more so that society shifts its point of view and no longer accepts it. And so they, at that point, can say, okay, we're going to change this. We're incentivized to change it, especially at this moment when there's having this kind of Me Too moment for this kind of racial justice stuff. That's why. I'm curious on what TYT was going to do. Are they going to change their name also, being as they're basically based on a group that started or committed a massacre? We will see. If people are throwing over statues, TYT also needs to be one of those things that get tossed over. In fact, maybe that's a show in and of itself. Like, share, subscribe.